Kia ora, welcome to the next in our monthly webinar series. Today we'll be looking at all kinds of identifying numbers, codes that we use to keep track of what thing we're talking about within the system and how we can use those codes or identifying numbers in different ways. I'll first show you some examples of how identifying numbers are used outside of Vernon to explain some general concepts. Here I have an Excel spreadsheet with some example basic catalogue records. We can see on the left-hand side of Excel, each of these different rows of cataloguing information has a row number. So we could talk about, for instance, the bowl of flowers by referring to it as row number 4. We might then want to manage other kinds of information, for instance, people that relate to these objects. In Excel, that might be split out into a separate tab or a separate spreadsheet. So I, for example, have a second tab of people information. Again, we can see row numbers for the different people that we have. However, if I insert a new row of information, we can see that those row numbers are changing. If I was adding a 5th person, we can see that the row numbers on all of the subsequent entries have changed. So what we could do is have a column where we've got a permanent unchangeable number. And that's the concept that we call the System ID in Vernon. It's a number that's allocated to a record when it's created, and that number can't ever be changed. And that provides a way of the system referencing that record at any point in the future and always knowing that it's going to be the same record that's being referred to. If I go back to my object sheet, we can see that we've listed the artist that relates to each of these different works. However, at this point, I'm essentially duplicating those artist names. If we later decided that there was some information about Pauline Thompson that had changed, I would have to do that on each of these entries. So within Vernon CMS, other related concepts like people are split into separate files. Each of those files have their own unique identifying numbers. So the system IDs might repeat in different files, but they refer to just a specific record type. So System ID 1 in the person file isn't the same as System ID 1 in the object file. I've now modified my spreadsheet to include a column for the artist ID. So that's using the System ID of the artist to provide a link between these two different spreadsheets. I've then got a formula in the next column that's automatically pulling out the information from that second tab. So for instance, if I go back to the people information, if I decided that the first name of one of these artists is incorrect, I could change that. And if we learned some other information like the place of birth, we could add that in. Now, when I go back to my objects table, because I know the ID of each of those artist records, I'm able to dynamically pull in the latest information from that related record. So we can see that automatically the two entries for Pauline Thompson at the top and the last one have all updated with her new middle name. And we can see that Tuani Thibault now has the artist's birthplace. And so that's the essentials of how Vernon is working. Every record in the system has a permanent system ID, and the system uses that to interconnect records and pull in the latest information at any point that you're working on different screens. I'll swap now to our demo system, and we'll show some extended examples of how we use these identifying numbers. I have an example record here of a military coat. Every record has that permanent system ID, and we can see that up in the top in the main toolbar. So the ID field shows us that unique permanent identifier that can't ever be changed. So for example, I could search by that ID. That's one of the key fields that Vernon always searches on. So I could bring up record 60, and we can see the ID popping up there. There are other numbers that the system keeps track of as well, and the accession number is an example of that. So the accession number is the number that you've assigned to the record, and it can be a complex number, perhaps consisting of years, sequence numbers, and various alphabetic parts. There are cases, however, where the accession number might be just a plain sequence number. So I'll search for record 62. And I've found that because there's an accession number of 62. Vernon CMS searches first on the accession number always. So in this case, I've found accession number 62, but perhaps I was specifically looking for a record with system ID of 62. We can override those search options up in the top search bar. And we can do that either with the triple dot menu, which will give us options to search on only one of the things which it looks at under the simple search. Or we can use any of these search keys when we're typing to quickly search on just one of those elements. So for example, I can see that system IDs can be looked up directly by using the search key ID. Those search keys are just entered before whatever text you want, with the backslash separating the key and the text that you type in. So in that example, if I want to find record number 62, I could type in ID \62, and it would no longer look at the accession number. And now I've found my way to the record that has that specific ID. Like we saw in Excel, person records also have IDs. So if I bring up the separate person identification screen, and I'll do a quick search for Mary Smith. Here we see that there's actually two person records, both for Mary Smith. And that's a valid possibility. There might be two completely different people that happen to have the same name. And we can see that they're kept as separate records by both of them having separate IDs. And I've used the show IDs tick box here to show those system IDs in the search results. Those IDs become important when you're making sure that you're linking to the right person, and particularly in cases like cleaning up data. Maybe those are genuine duplicate records, and you could check both of the different records and decide which one you're wanting to keep. So I can see in this case, for instance, the first record has some details like place of death and some contact information, whereas the second record only has the basic information. So I might decide that second record is the duplicate, and by using the IDs later on when I do an authority report replace, I can make sure I'm replacing all instances of person ID 280 with the one that we do want to keep. Those identifiers can also be used as a way of linking the records. So although I could type in Mary Smith in the artist field and find the two matches, I can also use the IDs of a related record anywhere in the system. So if there's some particular terms or related records that you're frequently using, you could use the ID field as a way of getting a shortcut to that particular person. So for example, if Mary Smith was actually one of our catalogers, I could skip to the last page, and instead of typing a name and getting two matches, I can type in 280 and directly get to that specific person and know that it's the right correct link. I'll open up the military coat that I was looking at before. We might want to add a link to another person on this record, perhaps the associated service person who wore this military coat. I could do that through the subject and association screen on the left. In this case, I know an identifying number for this particular person. I know their service record from the NZ military. So I could type in that service number. And that's given me a shortcut to that particular person. This is the first example I've used where that's not a system ID. It's another identifying number that's just been recorded on that related person record. So let's jump over to that person record and see how that's been noted. I can use the Go To button to jump to that related person record. The names table at the top records variations of that person's name. It might be things like a maiden name for an individual. It could be things that they're also known as. It might be an acronym. But we can record things like identifying numbers in that table as well. So here I've recorded a name type, which I've called service number, NZ military. And then I've just used the last name field to fill in that detail. Because Vernon's searching on all the possible names when we're typing in a person field, it's found that match using that serial number. So this is something Auckland Museum are doing to record all of the service numbers of all of the military personnel that they've recorded in the person database of their system. We can also record other identifying numbers on the object records. I'll open up a saved list that I've made earlier of some examples of these. In the military coat, for instance, on the last tab in the other ID table, we've recorded the entry number. So when this military coat arrived at the museum, there was a formal entry receipt that was given to the donor, and we've noted that entry number here on the last tab. Like many of the fields in Vernon, this field is repeatable because we see it in this table. So you could have multiple entry numbers, and each of those can be optionally qualified by a type and perhaps notes. The system comes with a few example types, but that's just a term list where you can add in terms that are relevant to your specific collection. And so these are examples that we have within our demo system. We can see on the second record, which is a Crownland vase, we've got a design number that was stamped on the base of that item. Those ID numbers are also searched at quick search. So we could type in something like a design number at a quick search and get back all of the records that link to that number. Lastly, I've got a piece of porcelain, a white plate. And here's an example where I've got two different identifying numbers. So the first other ID is a catalogue number. And I've recorded some notes to say what particular catalogue from that pottery that this particular plate appeared in. And then like the previous item, we also have a design number. So those are examples of how we can record identifying numbers that relate to objects. We can also record numbers that relate to activity records. On the left-hand side, we have the different activities that Vernon manages. So all of the different processes that happen to objects in their lifetime at your organization. One example might be an inward loan, where you're managing items that have been lent to you. Each of those loans still has its own unique system ID, like we saw for the objects and the people. So I could type in 1 and bring up record number 1. And we again see that up in the top toolbar. However, for inward loans, there's also a dedicated field for loan file number. So the lending organisation may have assigned its own loan number, and you need to record that within the system. That's something you can search on in the simple search bar. So we can see that this item had IL 2000.1 as its file number. And if I just come into the system, that would be something that I could do a search on. And so that concept holds true for all of the activity files. You have options of adding in file numbers, plus you can also use the system ID as its own permanent number that the system's automatically allocating. One of the options we have within the system is to bulk link images that exist outside of the system and linking them to the correct object record. Most often that's by matching up the accession numbers with accession numbers that appear as part of the image file names. However, the system can do the same thing with ID numbers. So if you had image file names that include the system ID, provided that it's clearly separated from other text in the file name using a consistent punctuation character, for example, the system can match those files to the correct object records and link the two together. I'll show a quick example of that. Under the imaging menu, we can use import and link images. That gives us the option of searching across all of the files in a particular folder and finding whether any of those match object records that you have within the system. So I'll just pick my default images folder. So we can see that normally it'll be automatically matching on the accession number. We can also optionally apply logic for any prefix or suffix in that file name that we want to discard. So that's where we would use punctuation to look for to maybe get rid of any notes that were at the end of the file name. But we can override that to specifically look at the system ID field. And then I can click on display matches for the system to search through. Most of our file names in the demo system are named after accession numbers, so it's going to say that it was unable to match those. But there are a couple that I've got that were named using the system ID. The system automatically checks to see whether those images are currently linked, and if it is, it'll just give you a note to say that it's already matched, and it'll skip doing anything further with those. But in the case of these two images, neither of them are currently linked to the system, and it's telling us which object ID they would connect to. So I've got an image 255.jpg, which is of course system ID 255. So that's another example where you can make use of these permanent identifiers to help you connect different things. We can also make use of List Manager to copy and paste things that are identifying numbers from other systems. I'll open up List Manager and we'll just start with a brand new list. In Excel, I've already pre-created some examples. So I've got these two records. Like we saw before, I can use those numbers to look up those records, and I can do that in bulk in List Manager. So I could, for instance, copy the accession numbers, and I could paste that back into Vernon. So I can do edit, paste. However, those numbers aren't necessarily guaranteed to be unique. And here's an example of where that might go wrong. So I've got two different objects that have similar accession numbers. So Vernon's found both of those and it's asking which one do I actually mean. So I could pick the first one. The second one's a unique match, so that's coming automatically. I could alternatively use the ID numbers, which are more likely to be an exact match. Let's copy the ID numbers instead. I'll paste those ID numbers in. And we'll see that we get the same issue we had earlier, that number 62 is actually an identifying number in the accession number field. So it's found ID number 60 and it's found accession number 62, just because it's prioritizing the accession number. So we could at this point go a step further and force the system to look only at the system ID. And we can do that in the same way that we did within the simple search earlier in this session. In Excel, I've created a column that already has that prefix in it. I did that with a simple Excel formula, just combining the text of ID backslash with the cell that was beside it, and then I just copied that formula down my whole spreadsheet. So that was a way to quickly add that prefix to possibly hundreds or thousands of items. Now when I copy that text, the system will only be doing that ID lookup, and we get a match for those two exact items, which are the specific items we're looking for. On the first page of the identification screen, we've got that accession number field, and that's a special field in the system because it's doing a number of different things. It's validating those numbers to make sure that they conform to any rules that you've set up as to how those numbers should be formatted. It's storing it in a format that allows you to intelligently sort on those, so that it knows that the sequence of 1, 2, and 10 is that order, not an alphabetic order, which would be 1, 10, and 2. It can also allow you to do things like range searching, and it can do defaulting of those numbers. So let's look at some examples of those. I could add in an extra prefix on here, or suffix. When I try to leave that field, it's enforcing those rules, and this isn't actually a valid number according to the rules that we've set up in our demo system. I could alternatively get the system to default the next possible number. So if I click in that field, it will automatically default the next available number. And it's keeping track of that across the whole system. So there might be multiple people cataloging at the same time, and it's able to work out the next number for you. We can also use the Options key or the down arrow icon on the right to see all of the formats that have been created and what the system currently has recorded as the next available number. And so using all of that, we can do some quite sophisticated searching on accession numbers. I could, for instance, look for an accession number range. So rather than typing in just one accession number, I can use ... as the special search operation, and then say a second search, which will be a subsequent number that I want to look up to. So maybe all the way up to number 30. And that's now done a search that's included all of those different items. All of those things are set up in part of the system maintenance menu. That's under Tools, System Maintenance, Accession Number Tool, and then the Accession Number Format screen is where each of those different formats with its rules are defined. These were the different numbers that existed in my system, and I'll just open up one of those as an example. We can define quite specific rules saying what are the individual segments or pieces of an accession number and what validation will be applied to each of those different segments. So we can see in the case of this particular format, it's allowed to have a prefix, which must match the pattern of just the letter A. It can have a year, which must be exactly 4 numeric characters. And it can have a sequence number, which can be any number of numeric characters as long as it's a maximum of 3 characters. So it could be a single digit up to 3 digits. Those are patterns that we can help you set up, and there's something that we set up in advance whenever we do data migrations for people. We can also export those numbers out for other purposes. An example might be to print barcodes so that you can uniquely match up to a particular record when you scan a barcode. I'll choose a small number of records and then we'll create some barcodes for those. If we look at all the artworks that I have by Pauline Thompson and pick all of those 3, I've already pre-created a report that will allow me to make some barcodes for these items. I'll click on the reporting shortcut button and I'll choose the word merge barcodes report that I've created. If I edit that template, I can just show you how that works. That particular report only includes 3 fields. It could include more if you're wanting other human readable information to be on the label. But in my case, it includes the system ID, which we know is the only way to exactly and permanently match up to a particular record. And then it also includes the title and the accession number of the item. In the formatting options page, I've already created a Microsoft Word document that has exactly the layout I want. We could choose to modify that layout document just so that we can see how that's actually been set up. So at this point, I have 3 records and I've chosen how I want to output them out of the system. So I could run the report. If I send that to the screen, it's first going to give me a preview of the template. So this particular template just uses a standard Word document. It's been set up to have 2 columns. So they're relatively narrow barcode labels. And if there were 20 items, it would wrap up to the second column. I've embedded a square where it's going to include the primary image for each record, because the image might be helpful when you're referencing those labels in the storeroom. I've got some simple text display of the 3 fields I included, the accession number, the title, and the ID, just with semicolons between them. I've then repeated the system ID field, but I've used a special font. So there's free fonts which you can get on the internet that will format characters in a barcode font. Barcodes are just special characters for displaying things like letters and numbers using the stripes that we're familiar with on a barcode. So the number 1 might be 2 thick stripes and a thin stripe, and so on for each subsequent letter. If I change the font for that particular field, we can see that it's just simply embedding that same field, the system ID, and then there's an international standard for barcodes that the barcode content should start and end with an asterisk. So I've hard-coded that in my Word document, and that's how a barcode scanner is able to validate that it's scanned all of the content of that barcode and hasn't missed some bit that was slightly out of view. So I could run this report. If I hadn't chosen to modify it in Vernon, I would have just gone straight to the final output. But here I've chosen to preview the template, so I can now choose the view option and use the built-in macros to produce a final report. And that'll take whatever selection of records we currently had in Vernon and then format it to that style. So we can see the system ID is now appearing as that striped barcode, and then the other three fields are appearing as text. We could now print that off, and we could later use either a USB cable or Bluetooth connected barcode scanner anywhere within Vernon that can accept a simple search. So you could click in the search bar, scan a barcode and bring up the correct item, or you could be in other places like the bulk move screen. So if you were moving those items, we'd open up the bulk move screen and scan maybe several different barcodes to quickly fill in what objects we're talking about as part of that location move. Within files, particularly if there's a very small number of terms, it can sometimes be useful to have a system ID which isn't a number, but is perhaps a code, because that code's going to be easy to remember when you're typing it in the future. So if I look at my department, we can see that some of those have ID numbers and some of them have alphabetic characters. When we create a term, so now I'm in the department file, if I click on a new term, it automatically assigns the next possible number. It is possible to force Vernon to allocate a specific ID number, either numeric or alphabetic, by using that same quick search option we saw before. So I can say ID /, and then if we've got, say, a pathology collection, I could do PTH as a code. The system will warn me that that can't be found, and at that point it offers me the option of creating a new term that has that ID. So I've forced the system to use that particular ID, and I could add that as a department. Thanks very much, and I hope you all have a great day.